Infertile millionaire is shocked when a humble young woman saves his self-respect and gives him twin sons. Hello and welcome, dear listener, to Alcot Stories Channel, where every tale is woven with emotion, adventure, and heart. I'm your storyteller, Alcott Brian, here to guide you through captivating journeys, unforgettable characters, and stories that will stay with you long after the final chapter. Get comfortable as we dive into another world, one full of passion, dreams, and endless possibilities. So sit back, relax, and let your imagination take flight, because your next unforgettable adventure begins right now. Landon Pierce stood at the vast floor-to-ceiling windows of his high-rise penthouse, looking out over the glittering city lights below. His piercing steel-blue eyes seemed to pierce through the endless ocean of people below, though no one would ever be able to see the ache in his heart. He had everything: money, power, status, but none of it could fill the deep, aching emptiness that had consumed him ever since the devastating diagnosis. Infertility, a single word that had torn apart his future. The idea of fatherhood, the dream he had clung to for so many years, was now an impossibility. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled dark hair, his jaw tightening in a habitual response to the frustrations he'd long buried. Landon had built an empire from the ground up. He was ruthless in business, commanding in the boardroom, admired by colleagues, and feared by competitors. But in the privacy of his penthouse, away from the prying eyes of the world, he felt completely and utterly alone. The doctor's words echoed in his mind, as clear as the moment they had been spoken. "There is no chance. You cannot have children, Landon." At the time, he had barely heard them. His mind had been a storm of emotions: anger, disbelief, denial. But now, months later, the weight of the truth settled like 1,000 tons on his chest, suffocating him. The truth was, Landon had never truly felt the warmth of a family. Raised by a cold, distant father who only cared about his business empire, and a mother who had disappeared from his life at an early age, Landon had learned to live with loneliness. Relationships had come and gone, each one leaving him more jaded than the last. He had always thought that one day he would meet someone who would fill that void, someone to build a family with. But now, that dream had been ripped away from him. A bitter chuckle escaped his lips as he gazed down at the sprawling city. He could have anything he wanted: luxurious cars, the finest suits, an endless stream of beautiful women. But none of that mattered. None of it could give him the one thing he wanted most: fatherhood. He closed his eyes, the weight of it all too much to bear. He had wanted to be a father, to share love and build memories with his own children, to finally experience the kind of life he had been deprived of as a child. But instead, he was left with the cold, sterile silence of his penthouse, a prison of his own making. Landon's mind drifted to the few relationships that had come closest to lasting, those fleeting moments of hope where he thought he could finally let someone in, only to find himself pushing them away as soon as things got too close. The idea of having a family had once seemed so real, so attainable. Now it felt like a distant dream, one that was impossible to reach, no matter how hard he tried. He set his jaw, unwilling to show any sign of weakness. He had built this life on strength, on his ability to overcome every obstacle in his path. But infertility had broken him in a way that no amount of wealth or power could fix. A sudden knock at the door broke his reverie, and he turned away from the window, surprised by the intrusion. The staff knew better than to disturb him during his moments of solitude, so who could it be? He moved toward the door, opening it to reveal his assistant, Maria, standing in the hallway with a concerned expression on her face. She was holding a folder in her hands. "Mr. Pierce, I have the quarterly report you requested," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "I also thought you might want to know that the board has been calling. They're eager to meet with you." Landon stared at her, the harsh edge of his mood not softened in the slightest by her presence. "I'll deal with the board later. Just leave the report on the desk." Maria hesitated, glancing at him for a moment, her eyes flickering with something close to concern, but she quickly masked it. "Of course, Mr. Pierce. Is there anything else I can do for you?" Landon hesitated, wanting to dismiss her quickly, but a pang of loneliness suddenly hit him hard. The silence of the penthouse, the cold emptiness that stretched before him, was suffocating. He could feel it creeping up on him again, the crushing isolation that had become his only companion. "No, thank you," he muttered, his voice flat, almost detached. Maria gave a polite nod and turned to leave, but she paused at the door. "Mr. Pierce, if you ever need anything—" She trailed off, uncertain of how to finish the sentence. Landon looked at her, and for a fleeting moment he saw the concern in her eyes, the gentle nature she rarely allowed to show through her professional demeanor. But he quickly shoved it aside. He wasn't someone who needed saving. Not anymore. He could handle this. He had handled everything in his life alone. "Good night, Maria," he said curtly, shutting the door before she could say anything more. He stood there for a moment, staring at the blankness of the door, before he walked back to the window, his mind filled with the same empty thoughts. In the quiet of his high-rise, he was forced to face the painful truth of his reality. He was a man who had everything except the one thing he truly wanted: family. And it seemed that dream was slipping farther and farther from his grasp with each passing day. Elena Rivera adjusted her apron, the weight of the day's stress weighing heavily on her shoulders. It had been another grueling double shift at the upscale hotel, and the hours seemed to stretch on endlessly. Her body ached from the constant movement, her feet sore from running up and down the stairs, but she kept her head high. Her mother's medical bills were mounting, and Elena's determination to provide for her was the only thing that kept her going. She had always been strong, resilient in the face of hardships that seemed too great to overcome. At just 25, Elena was already carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders, balancing a demanding job with the worry of her mother's failing health. She had learned to hide her worries behind a smile, a mask that kept the world from seeing the exhaustion in her eyes or the deep pain in her heart. Tonight, the restaurant was unusually busy. The snowstorm outside was relentless, and the cozy atmosphere inside seemed like a refuge for guests looking to escape the chill of the world. Elena had worked here for nearly 3 years, but each night felt just as draining as the last. Despite her quiet nature and hard-working attitude, she was always polite, always professional, yet never truly seen. As she made her way through the crowded dining room, her eyes caught a glimpse of a man sitting at a corner table by the window. His presence seemed to demand attention. Tall, with dark, perfectly combed hair and a sculpted jawline that looked as though it had been chiseled by an artist, he was every bit the type of man who could command an entire room with just a glance. But it wasn't his physical appearance that drew her in. It was the coldness that radiated from him, an aura of isolation, as though he were not truly present, not truly alive in the moment. Elena couldn't quite place why it unsettled her, but there was something about the way he stared out the window that made her feel as though she were intruding on a private grief. She didn't have time to dwell on it, though. There were other guests to attend to, other orders to take, but as the night wore on, she found herself returning to his table, refilling his wineglass and delivering his food. She made sure to maintain a professional distance, but each time she approached, something inside her stirred. His gaze, always intense, always distant, followed her movements, and though he never spoke more than a few words, Elena couldn't help but feel the weight of his silent presence. Something about him was different. The coldness in his eyes didn't just come from the weather. It was as though it had settled deep within him, a part of him he couldn't shake. Finally, as the evening wore on and the storm outside continued to rage, she approached him once again to check if he needed anything. She was used to catering to the needs of the rich and entitled guests who visited the hotel, but there was something about this man that felt far removed from the usual clientele. His eyes met hers when she approached, and for a brief moment, time seemed to freeze. There was a stillness between them, as though the world outside had ceased to exist. His icy blue eyes, so striking, held something she couldn't quite decipher. He didn't speak at first, just studied her with a quiet intensity. It wasn't the look of someone admiring beauty, but something else, something deeper, more calculating. For a moment, Elena felt a flutter of unease. She was used to being invisible to people like him, rich, successful, cold. But there was something about this moment that made her feel seen, and it unsettled her. "Do you need anything else?" she asked softly, her voice steady despite the inexplicable rush of nerves she felt. Landon Pierce looked up at her, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, Elena wondered if he even heard her. His lips parted, then he spoke, his voice low, smooth, almost hypnotic. "No," he replied simply. "I'm fine." His response was curt, but the way his eyes lingered on her for a fraction of a second felt like an unspoken question. There was an edge to his gaze, a subtle vulnerability buried beneath the cold exterior. Elena couldn't place it, but she felt it deep within her chest, an almost magnetic pull. The silence stretched on, and for a moment Elena wondered if she had imagined the entire encounter. But before she could pull herself away, something unexpected happened. Landon's eyes softened just a fraction, and his lips twitched into the faintest of smiles, a gesture so small, so fleeting, that Elena almost convinced herself she hadn't seen it at all. It wasn't a smile of warmth, but one of acknowledgement. Recognition, perhaps. For a moment, it was as if the world outside had ceased to exist for the two of them, the storm forgotten in the wake of this unexpected connection. But just as quickly as it came, the moment passed. Landon returned his gaze to the window, his thoughts seemingly far away again. Elena stood there for a moment, her heart beating faster than it should have. It was a feeling she couldn't explain, an inexplicable flutter in her chest, a tug at her heartstrings that made no sense. She forced herself to turn and walk away, though a part of her couldn't shake the feeling that something had just changed, something she couldn't name. The evening wore on, but Eleanor couldn't stop thinking about him. The man in the corner, the man with the cold blue eyes who had looked at her like no one ever had before. And though she tried to ignore it, she couldn't help but wonder what had drawn her to him. What was it about Landon Pierce that made her feel like she had crossed some invisible line? As the night came to a close and she clocked out, Elena stepped into the snowy streets, the chill in the air doing little to soothe the warmth that had settled in her chest. Her mind lingered on Landon, his coldness, and the brief spark of something deeper. It was a fleeting encounter, yet it felt significant in ways she couldn't explain. And though she knew she would never see him again, she couldn't shake the feeling that fate had just woven their paths together in ways neither of them could yet understand. The weeks after their first encounter passed by in a blur for Elena. She continued with her double shifts at the hotel, juggling the endless responsibilities of caring for her ailing mother and trying to keep her head above water. But her thoughts kept drifting back to Landon Pierce, the cold, aloof billionaire who had left an inexplicable mark on her. She tried to ignore the way he lingered in her mind, telling herself it was just another passing moment, nothing more than a fleeting connection. Yet as the days went on, something began to change. Elena noticed a pattern. Landon returned to the hotel again and again. Every time it was the same. He asked for her by name, seeking her out in the vast, bustling space of the luxury restaurant. And with each visit, Eleanor found herself growing more curious about the man who seemed so distant, yet so undeniably captivating. He never seemed to smile, never seemed to show any emotion beyond the sharp, calculating demeanor of a man who had everything and wanted for nothing. Yet when their eyes met, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, as though there was something beyond his cold exterior, a part of him that he was trying to protect or perhaps hide from the world. One evening, as she served him his usual meal, Elena couldn't help but notice how differently Landon was acting. He seemed unusually focused on her, his gaze lingering just a little too long. It wasn't just a passing glance, but something more, a quiet, unspoken tension between them that neither of them acknowledged. Elena placed the plate in front of him and started to turn away, but then she heard him speak her name softly, as though testing the sound of it on his lips. "Elena," he said, his voice low and almost hesitant. She froze, her back still turned toward him. The way he said her name, almost like a whisper, sent a shiver down her spine. She turned slowly, meeting his gaze, unsure of what he was about to say. Would you—" He cleared his throat as though gathering his thoughts. "Would you join me for a charity gala this weekend?" Elena blinked, taken aback. She had assumed his interest in her was purely professional, nothing more than a passing moment. But this was different. A gala with him. She hadn't been to one of those events in years, and she certainly hadn't expected to be asked to one by a man like Landon Pierce. She hesitated, not sure how to respond. "I don't think that's a good idea. I'm just a waitress here, Mr. Pierce. I'm not really the type of person you'd want at a gala." Landon's expression didn't shift. His eyes remained locked on hers, unwavering and steady. "Eleanor," he said again, softer this time, "I'm asking you because I want you there. Please come. It'll be a night for a good cause. And I think it's time you let yourself enjoy something for once." There was a pause as Elena searched his face for any sign of insincerity. She found none. Despite his cold exterior, there was something genuine in his eyes, something unspoken that she couldn't quite explain. Her initial instinct was to refuse, to remind herself of the vast difference between them. But something inside her shifted. She hadn't been to a gala, hadn't allowed herself to be a part of something more than just survival in a long time. And here, in front of her, was an opportunity she hadn't expected, but one she couldn't ignore. Finally, she nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Okay, I'll go." Landon's lips twitched into the briefest of smiles, a small glimmer of warmth in his usually guarded expression. "Good," he said simply, before looking away. The moment passed as quickly as it had arrived, but Elena could feel the weight of it settle in her chest. The day of the gala arrived, and Elena found herself standing in front of her mirror, staring at the woman in the reflection. She was nervous, beyond nervous. This wasn't her world. The glittering world of high society, with its elegant gowns and champagne glasses, was a far cry from her life as a waitress at the hotel. But she had agreed to go, and now she had to figure out what to wear. She had one dress, a simple, elegant gown she had bought on sale a few years ago for a wedding she had attended. It wasn't extravagant, but it was the best she could afford. She slipped it on, the soft fabric hugging her curves in a way that felt foreign to her, as though she had never worn something so beautiful. The moment she stepped into the hotel lobby, the world around her seemed to shift. The chandelier above cast a soft, golden glow over the room, and the guests milling around in their tuxedos and gowns seemed like they belonged to a different universe altogether. She felt like an outsider, small, invisible in a sea of beauty and wealth. When Landon arrived, it was as though the room shifted around him. His presence was magnetic, effortless, powerful, and commanding. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that seemed to make him even more intimidating, yet more intriguing than before. As he approached her, Elena's breath caught in her throat. She had never seen him like this before. Without the cold walls he usually erected, Landon seemed almost human. The brief flicker of surprise in his eyes when he saw her confirmed that he wasn't used to seeing her outside the confines of her work uniform. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Elena's heart raced, and she couldn't help but feel like the world had become a little smaller, a little more intense. "You look," Landon began, his words trailing off for a second as he took her in, "stunning." The compliment left Elena speechless, her cheeks flushing. "Thank you," she replied, her voice softer than she intended. They stood there for a moment, the electricity in the air palpable. Elena had expected to feel out of place, but when she was with Landon, all of her insecurities seemed to fade into the background. Throughout the night, Landon couldn't take his eyes off her. Elena, with her quiet strength, her beauty that wasn't born of pretense but of resilience, seemed to shine in the sea of glittering guests. She captivated him in a way no one had in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, he felt alive, like he was part of something real. As they danced, Elena in his arms, something shifted between them. For the first time, the world outside, the wealth, the expectations, the cold walls, faded. All that mattered was the warmth they shared in that fleeting moment, the connection that was as undeniable as it was unexpected. The days following the gala were quieter, but the tension between Landon and Elena remained, though it had shifted. What had started as an unexpected invitation now felt like something deeper, something neither of them was entirely prepared for. Their encounters became more frequent, but not in the way they had been before. Now there were long drives, intimate dinners, and conversations that carried weight. Landon found himself opening up to Elena in a way he had never expected. It started with the late-night dinners, the kind where the world outside seemed to fade away. At first, Elena had been cautious, unsure of where this newfound connection was leading. But there was something about the way Landon spoke to her, his words sometimes raw and vulnerable, that made her feel safe, safe enough to let down the walls she had carefully built around herself. One night, as they sat across from each other at a candlelit table in one of Landon's private dining rooms, the conversation turned darker. They were both tired from the weight of the world, Elena from her mother's deteriorating health, Landon from the pressure of his business empire. The room was quiet, the only sound being the soft clink of silverware against plates. And for the first time, Landon spoke without the guarded tone he usually wore. "I've always thought I had everything," he began, his voice distant, as if he were talking more to himself than to Elena. "Money, power, success. But I've realized none of that means anything if I can't have what I truly want." Elena looked up at him, sensing the depth of his pain. She placed her fork down and watched him, waiting for him to continue. The rawness in his eyes told her that this wasn't just a casual confession. "Do you know what it feels like to have everything in the world and still feel empty?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "To be so far removed from everything that truly matters. To know that you can't change the one thing you've always wanted." Elena's heart ached at the vulnerability she saw in him. She had always known there was more to Landon than his cold, stoic exterior, but hearing the words leave his lips made her realize just how much he was carrying alone. Landon paused, his eyes distant, as if reliving some past pain. He took a deep breath before continuing. "I can't have children, Elena," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm infertile. And for the longest time, I thought that was just another battle I could overcome. But it's more than that. It's who I am now, and I fear I will never be a father, never leave behind a legacy that isn't just about my name and my money." The confession hung heavy in the air. Elena didn't know what to say at first. She had never experienced this kind of pain, this kind of fear. But she could see it in him. The torment, the ache of a man who had everything but still felt incomplete. Instead of offering empty words of comfort, Elena simply reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her touch was gentle, her warmth a quiet reassurance. She didn't need to say anything. She knew that in this moment her silence spoke volumes. Landon looked down at her hand, then back up at her with an unreadable expression. He had never allowed anyone to see him like this before, not with this kind of rawness. He wasn't sure why he was opening up to her, why he had allowed himself to show her his darkest fears. But somehow, Elena had a way of making him feel safe, even when the world around him seemed so chaotic. "I don't know what to do with this," Landon admitted, his voice strained. "I feel like I'm just empty. Like there's no point in going on if I can't have what I really want." Elena squeezed his hand, her voice soft but steady. "You're more than your diagnosis, Landon. You're more than your money or your legacy. You're a person with dreams, with worth. And even if you can't have children of your own, that doesn't mean you won't leave a mark on the world. You've already done that in ways you don't even realize." Her words were simple, but they were what he needed to hear. Elena didn't offer false hope or try to sugarcoat the reality of his situation. Instead, she gave him something real, a chance to believe in himself again, even when it felt like everything was slipping away. As the night went on, their conversation deepened. Elena shared her own struggles, her fears about her mother's health, and the weight of always feeling like she was fighting an uphill battle. The more they talked, the more their bond grew, strengthened by the shared understanding that they were both broken in their own ways. In the weeks that followed, they found solace in each other's company. Their dinners became a ritual, their drives a time for quiet reflection. And with each passing day, Eleanor found herself drawn to Landon in a way that went beyond sympathy. There was something about him, his vulnerability, his strength, the way he let her in, that made her feel like they were two halves of a whole, two people who had been searching for something they didn't know they needed. One evening, as they sat together on the rooftop of Landon's penthouse, gazing at the stars, there was an intimacy between them that neither of them had expected. The air was cool, but the warmth between them kept the chill at bay. Landon turned to Elena, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the city lights below. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion, "for being here, for listening, for understanding." Elena smiled softly, her heart racing as she looked up at him. "I'm just doing what anyone would do, Landon. I'm here for you." For a moment they just sat there, in the silence, letting the words settle between them. And then, without thinking, Landon leaned forward, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative, as though they were both unsure of what it meant. But then, as the kiss deepened, the uncertainty faded. It was as though every fear, every longing they had carried for so long was poured into that one kiss, an unspoken promise that neither of them could fully articulate. When they pulled away, breathless, there was a quiet understanding between them. This was more than just a kiss. It was a turning point, a moment where everything shifted. The days following the gala were quieter, but the tension between Landon and Elena remained, though it had shifted. What had started as an unexpected invitation now felt like something deeper, something neither of them was entirely prepared for. Their encounters became more frequent, but not in the way they had been before. Now, There were long drives, intimate dinners, and conversations that carried weight. Landon found himself opening up to Elena in a way he had never expected. It started with the late-night dinners, the kind where the world outside seemed to fade away. At first, Elena had been cautious, unsure of where this newfound connection was leading. But there was something about the way Landon spoke to her, his words sometimes raw and vulnerable, that made her feel safe, safe enough to let down the walls she had carefully built around herself. One night, as they sat across from each other at a candlelit table in one of Landon's private dining rooms, the conversation turned darker. They were both tired from the weight of the world. Elena from her mother's deteriorating health, Landon from the pressure of his business empire. The room was quiet, the only sound being the soft clink of silverware against plates, and for the first time, Landon spoke without the guarded tone he usually wore. "I've always thought I had everything," he began, his voice distant, as if he were talking more to himself than to Elena. "Money, power, success. But I've realized none of that means anything if I can't have what I truly want." Elena looked up at him, sensing the depth of his pain. She placed her fork down and watched him, waiting for him to continue. The rawness in his eyes told her that this wasn't just a casual confession. "Do you know what it feels like to have everything in the world and still feel empty?" he asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. "To be so far removed from everything that truly matters. To know that you can't change the one thing you've always wanted." Elena's heart ached at the vulnerability she saw in him. She had always known there was more to Landon than his cold, stoic exterior, but hearing the words leave his lips made her realize just how much he was carrying alone. Landon paused, his eyes distant, as if reliving some past pain. He took a deep breath before continuing. "I can't have children, Elena," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm infertile, and for the longest time I thought that was just another battle I could overcome. But it's more than that. It's who I am now, and I fear I will never be a father, never leave behind a legacy that isn't just about my name and my money." The confession hung heavy in the air. Elena didn't know what to say at first. She had never experienced this kind of pain, this kind of fear. But she could see it in him. The torment, the ache of a man who had everything but still felt incomplete. Instead of offering empty words of comfort, Elena simply reached across the table and placed her hand over his. Her touch was gentle, her warmth a quiet reassurance. She didn't need to say anything. She knew that in this moment, her silence spoke volumes. Landon looked down at her hand, then back up at her with an unreadable expression. He had never allowed anyone to see him like this before, not with this kind of rawness. He wasn't sure why he was opening up to her, why he had allowed himself to show her his darkest fears. But somehow, Elena had a way of making him feel safe, even when the world around him seemed so chaotic. "I don't know what to do with this," Landon admitted, his voice strained. "I feel like I'm just empty. Like there's no point in going on if I can't have what I really want." Elena squeezed his hand, her voice soft but steady. "You're more than your diagnosis, Landon. You're more than your money or your legacy. You're a person with dreams, with worth. And even if you can't have children of your own, that doesn't mean you won't leave a mark on the world. You've already done that in ways you don't even realize." Her words were simple, but they were what he needed to hear. Elena didn't offer false hope or try to sugarcoat the reality of his situation. Instead, she gave him something real. A chance to believe in himself again, even when it felt like everything was slipping away. As the night went on, their conversation deepened. Elena shared her own struggles, her fears about her mother's health, and the weight of always feeling like she was fighting an uphill battle. The more they talked, the more their bond grew, strengthened by the shared understanding that they were both broken in their own ways. In the weeks that followed, they found solace in each other's company. Their dinners became a ritual, their drives a time for quiet reflection. And with each passing day, Eleanor found herself drawn to Landon in a way that went beyond sympathy. There was something about him, his vulnerability, his strength, the way he let her in, that made her feel like they were two halves of a whole, two people who had been searching for something they didn't know they needed. One evening, as they sat together on the rooftop of Landon's penthouse, gazing at the stars, there was an intimacy between them that neither of them had expected. The air was cool, but the warmth between them kept the chill at bay. Landon turned to Elena, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the city lights below. "Thank you," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion, "for being here, for listening, for understanding." Elena smiled softly, her heart racing as she looked up at him. "I'm just doing what anyone would do, Landon. I'm here for you." Without a word, Elena stepped closer, her head resting against his chest as they continued to sway. The warmth of his embrace, the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear, felt like a safe haven. It was as if the dance had drawn out something deep within them both, something that neither of them had been able to express in words. The music played on, filling the room with its slow, hypnotic rhythm, and in that moment, nothing else mattered. The uncertainties, the fears, the doubts, all of them were swept away in the melody. It was just them, two broken souls, finding solace in the darkness, their connection deepening with every step. The song eventually ended, but neither of them made a move to pull away. They remained in each other's arms, standing there in the quiet stillness, allowing the silence to speak volumes. Elena could feel the shift in Landon's posture, a change she couldn't quite name. But she knew this was a turning point. Something had changed between them, something irreversible. And as they stood there together in the dark, Elena knew that whatever lay ahead for them, this moment would be the one they would always remember. The night they truly began to understand one another. For a moment they just sat there, in the silence, letting the words settle between them. And then, without thinking, Landon leaned forward, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was soft at first, tentative, as though they were both unsure of what it meant. But then, as the kiss deepened, the uncertainty faded. It was as though every fear, every longing they had carried for so long was poured into that one kiss, an unspoken promise that neither of them could fully articulate. When they pulled away, breathless, there was a quiet understanding between them. This was more than just a kiss, it was a turning point. A moment where everything shifted. The days that followed their kiss were filled with a quiet, unspoken tension. The air between Landon and Elena had shifted, but neither of them knew how to navigate the delicate, fragile bond that had formed between them. Landon, ever the stoic man, had withdrawn slightly, unsure of what his feelings for Elena meant or how to handle the new, complex emotions stirring within him. Elena, on the other hand, felt like she was standing on the edge of something unknown, her heart both exhilarated and terrified by what had transpired. One evening, as they sat in silence in his penthouse, Landon's eyes flickered to the old phonograph sitting in the corner of the room, a piece of furniture he had inherited from his late mother. Something about it seemed out of place in the otherwise modern, sleek space, but the nostalgia it evoked was undeniable. Without a word, he stood and crossed the room, pulling the vinyl record from the shelf and placing it carefully on the turntable. The soft crackle of the needle touching the record filled the quiet room, followed by the slow, soothing melody of an old jazz song. Elena looked at him, slightly puzzled by his sudden action. But then, as the music swirled through the room, something shifted. Landon turned to her, his face softening. "Dance with me," he said quietly. The words hung in the air, gentle but firm, as though they were not just an invitation, but an unspoken plea. Elena hesitated for only a moment before standing up and moving towards him, her heart racing. As their hands met, her breath caught in her throat. He was so close, too close, yet perfect. The distance that had always existed between them seemed to disappear in an instant. They moved slowly, tentatively at first, as the music enveloped them. The room, bathed in the soft glow of the lamp beside them, became a world of its own, one where nothing and no one could touch them. Landon's hand rested on her back, his other holding her hand gently, guiding her in time with the music. Elena's hand was light on his shoulder, her body moving closer as they found a rhythm together. She could feel the heat of his body against hers, the intensity of his presence wrapping around her like a cocoon. The kiss they had shared lingered in the back of her mind. But this was different. There was no rush, no desperation. It was slow, deliberate, and filled with a quiet tenderness that neither of them had expected. For a moment they simply danced, their bodies in perfect harmony with the soft, rhythmic beat of the jazz. The world outside seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them. As the music swelled, so did the emotions between them, palpable and undeniable. Landon's eyes, once cold and distant, softened as he looked at her, and Elena found herself lost in his gaze. There was a vulnerability in his eyes that she had never seen before, a quiet longing that echoed her own. After months of guarded hope and heart-to-heart talks, Landon and Elena made a life-altering decision. They moved in together. The penthouse that once echoed with emptiness slowly transformed into a home filled with warmth and laughter. They agreed to pursue IVF using a donor, a choice that brought a strange mix of fear, hope, and silent prayers. It wasn't conventional, but it was real. It was theirs. The day the pregnancy test turned positive, Elena stood frozen in the bathroom, tears streaming down her cheeks. When she told Landon he didn't speak, he simply pulled her into his arms, holding her like she was the most fragile, precious thing in the world. And then came the second surprise, twins. Landon had always believed biology defined fatherhood. But as Elena's belly grew, so did his love. He was there at every appointment, every ultrasound, listening to the fluttering heartbeats with awe. He read parenting books late into the night, cradled her through morning sickness, rubbed her back when the aches got too much, and left little notes on her pillow before long workdays. He talked to her belly every night, whispering stories, promising protection and love. With every kick he felt through her skin, something inside him healed. He didn't need DNA to feel like a father. He already was one. Their relationship deepened in quiet, everyday ways, spooning cereal out of the box at 2 a.m., reorganizing baby clothes by color, dancing in the living room when Elena felt the twins move for the first time. Each moment was a thread, stitching their lives together. For the first time, Landon stopped fearing the future. He looked at Elena, glowing, laughing, sometimes crying, and saw everything he thought he'd never have. A family, a second chance, a reason to believe. At first, the news leaked quietly, a whisper on social media, a blurry photo of Elena entering a clinic with Landon. Then came the storm. Headlines exploded with cruel assumptions. Waitress seduces billionaire. Pregnant with a fortune. The media painted Elena as a schemer, spinning fairy tales into scandal. She avoided mirrors for days, unable to recognize the woman in those tabloids. Landon was furious. He hired lawyers to protect her privacy, but the damage was done. People whispered when they entered restaurants. Her co-workers offered forced smiles and veiled judgment. The warmth they'd built together began to flicker under the weight of public scrutiny. Then came Veronica, Landon's ex-fiancée. Beautiful, polished, and venomous. She appeared on a talk show with glossy lips and crocodile tears, claiming Elena had manipulated Landon at a vulnerable time, that she had stolen the life meant for someone else. Elena was shattered. She didn't sleep for days. She stayed off social media, buried the tabloid clippings in the trash, and questioned if love could survive a world so quick to judge. Landon tried to shield her, but even his money and power couldn't stop the emotional bruising. Eventually, he called a press conference. He told Elena she didn't have to come, but she insisted. Dressed in soft blue, one hand protectively over her stomach, she stood at his side as cameras flashed and murmurs filled the hall. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "I never wanted the spotlight. I only wanted love, and somehow I found it, in the last place I expected." Tears glistened in her eyes, but she held her ground. Her grace silenced the room. Then Landon took the mic. His voice was steady, steel beneath warmth. "Elena Rivera is not a gold digger. She is not a mistake. She is the strongest, kindest woman I've ever known. And she is the mother of my sons, my future, my heart." The applause was thunderous, but the most powerful sound was the silence between them. A promise that they would rise above every whisper and wound. Together. The nursery was nearly finished. Soft blankets folded neatly. Twin cribs side by side. Him still undecided, but love already overflowing. Elena waddled through the hallways, humming lullabies to her round belly, glowing with the magic of anticipation. But one quiet evening, as snow began to fall outside, she gripped her stomach and collapsed. The emergency room was a blur of alarms, rushed voices and cold sterility. Landon's world tilted. Doctors spoke in rapid terms: preeclampsia, restricted blood flow, fetal distress. His knees buckled, and for the first time in years, Landon Pierce felt utterly powerless. He signed consent forms with shaking hands, pressed kisses to Elena's forehead, and tried to hold himself together as they wheeled her into intensive care. The hours crawled. He didn't move from her side. Monitors beeped. Nurses came and went. The clock ticked, but Landon remained, hunched in the stiff chair. A man shattered, but refusing to let the pieces fall. He whispered things he never dared say aloud. How he had once hated himself for being infertile. How he thought no one could ever love a man who couldn't give life. How she had made him believe again. He told her he loved her, not for her beauty or kindness, but because she had given him the one thing he thought he didn't deserve, a family. As the machines clicked and the IV dripped, Elena stirred. Her lips parted, dry and weak, but her voice, though faint, was steady. "We're not going anywhere. We're a family." Tears rolled down Landon's face as he bent closer, cradling her fragile hand in his. That single sentence anchored him. Fear loosened its grip. In her pain, she had given him strength. Outside, the snow had turned to rain, and within that storm, the calm began to rise. The rain fell in heavy sheets that night, drumming against hospital windows like a heartbeat from the heavens. Nurses moved swiftly, doctors gave sharp commands, and the maternity ward became a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Elena, pale and drenched in sweat, gripped the sides of the bed, her breath ragged with pain, but her eyes never left Landon. He was at her side, fingers entwined with hers, whispering strength into every contraction. "You've got this," he said over and over, voice cracking with emotion. And though fear still gripped his heart, it was love, raw and fierce, that kept him grounded. Then came the cries, first one piercing and strong, then another, softer but sure. Twin voices brand new to the world. James and Lucas. Landon stood frozen for a moment as the nurses wrapped the boys in blankets. He hadn't expected the wave that hit him, gratitude so profound, it stole his breath. His knees went weak as he took James into his arms first. Followed by Lucas, they were small, warm, real. Two tiny lives cradled in the arms of a man who once believed he'd never be a father. Tears ran freely down his face, no shame, no restraint. "I love you," he whispered to both boys over and over, his voice thick with wonder. "You're mine. You're my sons." He turned to Elena, still recovering, her body trembling but her face shining with quiet triumph. She reached for his hand, her voice a soft whisper. "This is your legacy." Landon knelt beside her, pressing his forehead gently to hers. overcome by a love that no biology could define. In that dimly lit room, soaked in rainlight and joy, a family was born, not forged by blood, but by choice, by faith, and by a love that refused to give up. Spring had returned, painting the world in soft pastels and warm breezes. The once silent penthouse was now alive with tiny footsteps, cheerful squeals, and the joyful chaos of toddler life. Toys littered the floors, lullabies played from the nursery, and twin giggles echoed off the walls like music. Landon stood by the window one morning, holding a squirming James on his hip while Lucas tugged at his pant leg. He didn't wear his usual tailored suit, just a soft sweater and smile lines that hadn't existed a year ago. He looked around and saw not wealth, not glass and marble, but home. That afternoon, beneath a canopy of cherry blossoms in a quiet garden, away from cameras and crowds, he married Elena. She wore a simple lace gown, barefoot in the grass, her curls crowned with soft petals. Landon couldn't stop staring. He had seen power, fame and elegance, but never something so sacred. As they exchanged vows, their sons babbled from their grandparents' laps, unaware they were witnessing something holy. "You saved me," Landon said softly as he slid the ring onto her finger, his voice thick with emotion, "not just from loneliness, but from myself." Elena smiled through tears. "You gave me more than I ever dared to hope for." Later, as dusk settled and soft lights flickered through the trees, Landon rocked his sons in his arms. They reached for him, tiny hands curling into his shirt, eyes blinking sleepily. His heart swelled until it ached. He no longer saw himself as infertile or broken or lost. He was a husband, a father, a man rebuilt not by success but by love. "This," he whispered, kissing the crowns of their heads, "is the life I never dared to dream." And yet here it was, messy, magical, beautifully real.